2 million. That's how many times Zorin OS 18 was downloaded in under 3 months of its release. Of those 2 million downloads, more than 3/4 came from Windows machines. That works out to over 1.5 million downloads originating from people who were running Windows, not Linux hobbyists swapping between distributions. And by April 2026, 6 months after launch, the Zorin team confirmed the total had climbed to 3.3 million downloads. Sit with that for a second, because if you have any real background in Linux, if you've been following the desktop space for any serious amount of time, you know that number is genuinely strange. It doesn't fit the pattern. Ubuntu has been around since 2004. Linux Mint has been one of the most consistently praised distributions for over a decade. Fedora, Manjaro, Pop! OS, all of them have had loyal communities, strong reputations, legitimate engineering, and none of them produced a growth story remotely like this in a comparable time frame. Desktop Linux has been fighting for mainstream adoption for 30 years. And the joke, the actual running joke in tech circles, was that every single year was going to be the year of the Linux desktop. Nobody says that unironically anymore because it never arrived until something actually started moving. So what changed? And why this particular distribution? And why now in the span of about 6 months between October 2025 and April 2026? That's the question I went down a serious rabbit hole trying to answer, pulling from Tom's Hardware, Windows Central, The Register, XDA developers, Tech Republic, the Zorin blog directly, cross-referencing everything I could find. And what I came back with is a story that's not really about Linux getting suddenly and dramatically better overnight. It's about a very specific set of decisions Microsoft made, colliding with a very specific window of opportunity that the Zorin team had been quietly positioning themselves to walk through for years. Let's go back to October 14th, 2025. If you were paying close attention to the tech space that week, you already know the date. Windows 10 officially lost mainstream support on October 14th, 2025, after a decade of dominance on desktops and laptops worldwide. Microsoft issued its final free security patch. Coverage, or you've already moved on, that alone was a significant moment. But the detail that genuinely stopped me when I dug into the timeline is this. Zorin OS 18 launched on October 14th, 2025. The exact same day Microsoft ended mainstream Windows 10 support. Same day. Not a week later, not a month before. The same morning Microsoft closed a door on hundreds of millions of users, Zorin OS 18 was standing in the hallway holding another one open. And I've looked at a lot of product timing in tech. I genuinely cannot think of a cleaner moment of positioning, though calling it a coincidence would be inaccurate, because the Zorin team had been watching that October 14th deadline approach for years and built toward it deliberately. The Zorin group had teased Zorin OS 18 in September of 2025, right before Windows 10 ran out of support, seeing the opportunity in front of them and timing the launch to maximize it. 100,000 people downloaded it within the first 2 days. Within a month, that number had crossed 1 million. Over 78% of those downloads came from Windows machines. And that influx of new users reflected exactly the mission Zorin had been building toward, providing a better alternative for people being left behind. Microsoft's official answer for people in that position was to buy a new PC. That's not my characterization of their stance. Their communications included attention-grabbing full-screen pop-ups bearing a clear message. Buy a new PC, preferably a Copilot Plus model, or brace for the cyber threats that come with running unsupported software. For a lot of ordinary users, sitting in front of a perfectly functional 2015 or 2016 laptop, that answer didn't land particularly well. And when those users started searching for alternatives, genuinely searching, not just reading about Linux in theory, a significant number of them found Zorin OS at the top of results, polished, free, and specifically designed to not feel alien to someone coming from Windows. That collision between Microsoft's hardware wall and Zorin's launch timing is what produced those download numbers. But the numbers alone don't explain why people actually stayed, or why this particular distribution succeeded where years of Linux alternatives before it failed to break through. That part of the story is more interesting, and it's where we're going next. Here's the question that kept pulling me back while I was going through forum threads, Reddit migration communities, review roundups from ZDNet and XDA, and the comment sections of every major text publication covering this story. Linux has existed as a desktop option for over 30 years. There have been genuinely good distributions aimed at Windows users for at least 15 of those years. Ubuntu simplified the installation process dramatically. Linux Mint built one of the most stable and user-friendly desktop environments the open source world has ever produced. Pop! OS from System76 attracted real mainstream attention a few years back. So why didn't any of them produce a migration story like this? What Did Zorin actually do differently that turned curiosity into 2 million downloads in 3 months? The honest answer I kept arriving at wasn't technical, it was psychological. Zorin looked directly at that psychological barrier and built its entire interface architecture around removing it. Boot into Zorin OS 18 for the first time as a longtime Windows user, and what greets you is a familiar taskbar, a start menu, snap layouts, a unified settings panel, and smooth animations, all arranged where habit tells you they should be. It's not a Windows clone in the legally fraught sense. It's something more deliberate than that. A distillation of exactly where 30 years of Windows muscle memory expects interface elements to live, wrapped in a design that still feels modern and considered, rather than derivative or cheap. Reviewers who tested it independently described roughly the same reaction. They braced for disorientation, and the disorientation didn't come because everything was close enough to where instinct pointed. Zorin OS was designed specifically to make switching from Windows as smooth as possible, and that approach is what's working. Because the appeal isn't that it's a great Linux distribution, it's that it doesn't feel like one to someone who's never used Linux before. The installation experience is where Zorin made arguably its most important design decision because, historically, setup was the second biggest wall keeping casual users away from Linux entirely. For years, installing a distribution could mean manually partitioning drives, hunting down proprietary drivers and terminal sessions, and spending a weekend troubleshooting before you had a working desktop. Zorin OS 18 stripped almost all of that friction out. The installer recognizes over 170 Windows application installers and automatically suggests native Linux alternatives or web-based equivalents, rather than leaving users to figure out compatibility on their own. NVIDIA driver support comes as a simple checkbox during setup. The process uses plain language throughout, rather than technical jargon designed for someone who already knows what they're doing. Then Zorin OS 18.1 arrived in April 2026 and pushed the migration tooling further. The 18.1 release expanded the Windows App Detection database to recognize installers for over 240 common Windows A P applications and moved to Linux kernel 6.17, the same version shipping in the latest Ubuntu releases, bringing hardware support for Intel Xe3 graphics, AMD hybrid laptop GPUs, and gaming handheld, including the Asus ROG Ally and Lenovo Legion Go. By the time 18.1 launched, the Zorin team confirmed 3.3 million total downloads since version 18 appeared 6 months earlier. The project's momentum wasn't slowing after the initial Windows 10 end-of-life surge. It was holding. The Lite Edition in 18.1 specifically targets older computers with a refreshed XFCE desktop, while the main release delivers kernel 6.17 for maximum driver compatibility and security support runs. Through June 2029, a long enough runway that schools, small businesses, and budget-conscious organizations can genuinely plan around it. But here's the part that almost every tech publication covering the download numbers undersells, because it's harder to quantify than a milestone figure. What actually keeps people from going back to Windows? Once they've made the jump, isn't a single feature Zorin has that Windows doesn't. It's the accumulation of things Zorin doesn't have, that Windows increasingly does. No advertisements in the file manager or start menu equivalent, no AI assistant running persistently in the background that you didn't ask to be there, no telemetry settings scattered across 6 different menus in a WI that feels deliberately hard to fully navigate, no forced account sign-in just to use your own hardware. Updates install on your schedule, not on a timer set by someone whose business model doesn't always align with your actual preferences as a user. Individually, some of those might sound like minor annoyances. Stacked together, they represent something that a lot of users have been finding hard to articulate but easy to feel. The difference between owning a computer and renting the experience of using one from a company whose priorities have drifted noticeably away from yours over the past several years. And that feeling, more than a benchmark or a feature comparison, is what the migration communities and forum threads I spent time in kept coming back to as the real reason people made the jump and didn't reverse it. Start with the hardware wall, because that's the most concrete and least ambiguous part of the story. Canalys estimated that 240 million PCs did not comply with Windows 11's requirements, Machine S that were perfectly functional for everyday computing, but failed Microsoft's own hardware checklist. Most critically, the TPM 2.0 chip requirement that most hardware manufactured before around 2 by was a bit of my point. As 0016 simply doesn't include. To be specific about what that requirement actually means in practice, TPM 2.0 is a security chip that handles encryption, key storage, and boot time integrity verification at the hardware level. It's a legitimate security feature. Nobody serious is arguing that it doesn't serve a real purpose. The argument is about where Microsoft drew the cutoff line and how, still functional machines that line excluded. Windows 11 only officially supports 8th generation Intel processors, released in 2017 or AMD Ryzen 2000 series, and newer, meaning a laptop from 2015 or 2016 running a 6th or 7th generation Intel chip, which was premium hardware at the time of purchase, is categorically excluded regardless of how capable it remains for actual daily tasks. And Microsoft's answer for the owners of the OS 240 million machines delivered through full-screen pop-ups and official communications was to buy a new PC, preferably a Copilot Plus model with dedicated AI processing hardware built in. That advice lands very differently depending on your situation. For someone whose machine genuinely needed replacing anyway, it's a reasonable nudge. For someone sitting in front of but the hardware wall was only the first layer. Because even for users whose machines could run Windows 11, the operating system they upgraded to had changed in ways a lot of longtime users found. T's aggressive addition of AI-driven features have created significant user fatigue that extended well beyond the population of users with incompatible hardware. Advertisements appeared inside the Start menu and inside File Explorer, inside an operating system people had already paid for or received as a mandatory upgrade. Think about what that actually represents. The core navigation layer of a paid desktop operating system started serving ads. Telemetry and data collection settings got distributed across multiple menus in a configuration that a significant portion of the user base has described online as deliberately difficult to fully navigate and turn off. And then Copilot arrived, Microsoft's AI assistant, pushed directly into the taskbar as a persistent presence for a large share of users, whether they had asked for it or not. I had been using for years. The framing around it in online communities has been consistent across Reddit threads, forum posts, and comment sections. It felt less like a safety net and more like being charged to slow down a clock someone else set. So map out the actual position a large number of ordinary users found themselves in by late 2025. Their machine is incompatible with Windows 11 through no fault of their own. Their Windows 10i installation is no longer receiving security updates. Paying for extended security updates costs money annually for protection on hardware that Microsoft simultaneously tells them to replace. Adding to Windows 11 on compatible hardware means accepting an operating system with ads in the file manager, an AI assistant they didn't request, and telemetry settings that require deliberate effort to navigate. Buying a new Copilot Plus PC costs several hundred to over $1,000. Zorin OS alone reported more than 780,000 Windows users moving to Linux in the immediate aftermath of the Windows 10 end-of-life announcement. And that was just the first month's figure from one distribution. The broader Linux desktop numbers reflected the same pressure. StatCounter recorded Linux at nearly 3% of global desktop share in April 2026, and year-end 2025 estimates across Multu. IPIL tracking methods put the figure as high as 4.7%, the highest level Linux desktop share has reached on record. None of that happened because Linux got dramatically better overnight. It happened because the cost of staying on Windows, measured not just in money, but in autonomy, in privacy friction, in forced hardware decisions, in the persistent feeling that the operating system was optimizing for Microsoft's priorities rather than yours, crossed a threshold for a meaningful population of users at exactly the moment a genuinely accessible alternative was sitting ready and waiting. And the users crossing that threshold weren't developers or enthusiasts who had been considering the move for years. They were ordinary people, people with older laptops, people who just wanted their computer to do what they told it without negotiating. That specific demographic detail is what makes this moment different from every previous Linux growth story. And it's what makes the final piece of this story the one actually worth paying closest attention to. Windows still commands an overwhelming share of the global desktop market. Windows held above 94% of installs among Steam users, even as Linux was climbing, and Windows remains dominant across virtually every desktop tracking methodology available. A distribution hitting 3.3 million downloads in 6 months is a remarkable achievement in the context of Linux history. It is not, in raw and new, and be ears, a dent in Microsoft's installed base that Microsoft is likely losing sleep over today. That needs to be said clearly, because the honest version of this story is more interesting than the exaggerated one. What's actually worth paying attention to is the trajectory, and more specifically, the type of user driving it, because that's where the long-term implications actually live. StatCounter recorded Linux at roughly 3% of global desktop share in April 2026, with year-end 2025 estimates across multiple tracking methods, placing the figure as high as 4.7%, the highest level on record for Linux desktop share. Those numbers have real uncertainty baked into them because Linux systems frequently appear in the unknown category in browser-based tracking methodology, S, which means the true figure is likely higher than what StatCounter captures directly. The directional signal across every tracking source points the same way. Linux desktop share is growing. And it is growing specifically during a period when Microsoft's own policy decisions gave people a concrete reason to look elsewhere. SIR is continuing to discover and choose the platform on its own merits after the initial catalyst faded. Knee inflection point or a footnote. The gaming gap is real, and I'm not going to wave it away. Zorin runs Windows games through Valve's Proton compatibility layer, and while the compatibility picty, UR has improved dramatically over the past few years, it is not universal. Certain anti-cheat systems still block Linux users entirely. Specific titles have issues that don't exist on native OS. And DAOs. Zorin OS 18.1's move to Linux kernel 6.17 expanded hardware support for gaming handhelds, including the Asus ROG Ally and Lenovo Legion Go, which signals that the project is paying attention to gaming as a use case. But if your primary computing use involves competitive multiplayer titles with aggressive anti-cheat implementations, that's a real limitation worth knowing before you format a drive. For everything else that the majority of people who've watched this far actually do with their computers daily, browsing, documents, spreadsheets, video calls, streaming, creative work, email, productivity tools, Zorin OS 18 covers the use case without meaningful compromise. And there's a structural shift happening underneath all of this that makes the gap between what Linux can do and what Windows uniquely offers narrower in 2026 than it has ever been. The move toward browser-based tools, Google Docs, Notion, Figma, Canva, Microsoft's own Office 36.5 running through a browser, has quietly dismantled one of Windows' most durable structural advantages. The old argument that you needed Windows because that's where your software ran measurably weaker today than it was even 4 or 5 years ago. A capable browser running on Zorin OS handles most of what people actually use daily, identically to a capable browser running on Windows 11. The operating system underneath becomes increasingly irrelevant to the actual workflow. And then there's the network effect question, the one that actually determines long-term platform outcomes. When developers see meaningful numbers of users moving to a platform, they evolve and truly start building and testing for it. When hardware manufacturers see real demand, they start certifying compatibility. When software companies see where their customers actually are, their product roadmaps shift. That's the exact mechanism that kept Windows dominant for 3 decades. Inertia protected and reinforced by the fact that everyone was already there. Uncomfortable question for Microsoft's long-term desktop strategy is whether that same logic is capable of running in reverse, even slowly, driven not by a superior competitor, but B. What actually makes this moment different from every previous iteration of the Linux is finally taking off. Prediction that has circulated and died every year for 30 years is precisely the audience doing the switching. It's not developers hopping between environments, and it's not IT professionals who always knew the alternatives existed. It's ordinary users, Opal with older laptops that Windows 11 refuses to install on, people frustrated by advertisements inside paid software, people who want their computer to respond to their instructions without negotiating. Those are exactly the users platform incumbents have always assumed were too locked in, too unfamiliar with alternatives, or too comfortable with muscle memory to seriously leave. That assumption is being tested right now in real time by numbers that weren't supposed to be possible in the Linux desktop space. It didn't lose them to a technological breakthrough that made Linux suddenly unrecognizable from the platform it's been for years. It lost them because since October 14th, 2025, Windows 10 no longer receives security patches, and every newly discovered vulnerability stays permanently open for anyone still running it. Combined with a hardware wall that ruled out 240 million functioning machines, advertisements inside paid software, an AI assistant pushed in without consent, and a support cutoff that left users facing either a recurring payment or new hardware they didn't need, the cost of staying became high enough that a meaningful population of ordinary users decided the cost of leaving was lower. Zorin OS didn't have to become perfect to win those users. It had to be accessible enough, familiar enough, and ready enough, standing at exactly the right door at exactly the right mom. And based on everything I've gone through researching this, the 18.1 release in April 2026 suggests the team understands that their window isn't closing. It's still open. If you're on the fence about trying this yourself, here's what I genuinely suggest based on everything covered here. Dual boot is free. Installation from a USB drive takes under an hour. S for your specific workflow. The answer might be that Windows still makes more sense for you. That's a legitimate outcome. But the answer might also be that the thing you were afraid of turned out to be easier than the version of it you'd been imagining for years. If this gave you something worth thinking about, hit like. It genuinely helps research-driven coverage reach people who would actually find it useful. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of how this story develops, because the next chapter of the Windows versus Linux desktop question is going to be determined over the next 12 to 18 months, and I'll be covering it with the same sourcing standard as this video. Verified, dated, and cited, not recycled speculation. Let me know in the comments. Have you made the switch since Windows 10 support ended? And if you tried Zorin OS specifically, what was the moment you realized it was going to work for you?